Hello, this is a quick roundup of all the things that you should know about the text, The Bloody Chamber, so far. This is November 21st, so this is things that we've covered so far in class. You may have covered slightly different things in your own personal classes. Okay, try to mention the writer's intentions in any exam answer that you take. So think about, why has she rewritten fairy stories? Fairy stories are written and read to young girls, particularly forming their shape of what the world is like. Marriage, being beautiful, happy ever after, male saves the day. So you can understand why she revised that. Why does she use the Gothic form? It liberates her. It allows her to use her imagination to shift away from reality, to explore messages that she wants to explore. While she uses the Gothic form, she also subverts the Gothic form, because in many ways the Gothic form, like fairy stories, conveys the message that virginity is everything, females must be victims and saved by men, and that they are subject to entrapment, and perhaps she wants to challenge this. Remember, the short story form, we'll talk about this a bit later, but you're not dealing with a novel. Try not to make that big mistake by talking about this as a novel, but it's short story forms. And short story forms, because they are so brief, play on symbolism and ambiguity, showing rather than telling. We'll talk about this a little bit later. And perhaps you might want to think by the end of your study how this collection works as a collection. Why is The Bloody Chamber the first story, and why is Wolf Alice the last story, and what's been the journey in between? Okay, it's good to remember your context when dealing with this answer. Remember, it's worth 50% of your answer, so you have to put in context and link them specifically to the text. So let's consider the writer's context. She's a second-wave feminist writing in the 1970s, so she's interested in the power dynamics between genders. She's interested in power inequality. She's interested in female empowerment, alongside playwrights like Carol Churchill, who perhaps reacting against a female prime minister as well. You've got the female eunuch from the 70s as well, Germaine Greer's famous non-fiction account of female empowerment. Alongside this, you've got Laura Mulvey's theory of the male gaze, and how all texts, be it written or visual or artistic, are formed from the male perspective, and that we see the female through male eyes. And perhaps this is something that reoccurs through the short stories, this idea of the male gaze running through many of the stories and the symbolism of eyes. The structuralist movement is perhaps kind of allies with her work in terms of how texts are put together and how they follow particular structural motifs and patterns. And perhaps that's why she's chosen fairy stories and the Gothic form, because it has such recognizable motifs and patterns and symbolism, colour and plot devices. And she's interested in exploring these patterns and questioning why we have these patterns, and can we subvert these patterns. Obviously, you might have looked at her criticism of the Marquis de Sade and her essays, Sadian Women, and her views on pornography, and how they kind of relate perhaps to the idea of female sexual liberation. While Marquis de Sade's name is given over to sadism, in many ways she sees that there's some positives in the representations of female sexuality in a kind of liberal sense. She's also influenced by the French poet Baudelaire, whose poems kind of sort of focus on death and sex, and the recurring motifs of blood and red, and again the influence of fairy stories. She felt like fairy stories were rewritten and sanitized, and that she wants to bring them back perhaps to their true form, in which they perhaps explore non-Victorian ideas of sexuality and discovery. Have an awareness of her other works, and particularly perhaps Wise Children, the themes that are covered here. I'm not going to read through this. You can read through this at your own time by pausing this slide. You can see some of these themes reoccurring, perhaps in terms of the Bloody Chamber. The idea of intertextuality comes through in many of her stories because she's rewriting fairy stories. She's rewriting Gothic stories in many ways. She's rewriting the Dracula story. And she's rewriting the Bluebeard story. So she takes established forms, she makes allusions to other stories that we would recognize Pandora's box, the Mark of Cain, and she changes them and sees them in a new way. Perhaps also it's worth considering that her texts are not just solely looking at the female experience, but also looking at that of class. We have lots of absent fathers, poverty. We seem to see these tropes reoccurring in fairy stories, don't we? Sort of innocent but poor and beautiful girls. And so the idea of money and class comes into these stories as well, and it's worth bearing that in mind. Sometimes that's forgotten. Okay, it's harder to make kind of links between a person's life and their work sometimes, because then we kind of leap into the imagination. We can never be in the person's bedroom, we don't really know for sure, but some things that you could probably talk about is her experience in Tokyo and how she's seen perhaps the experience of women, particularly, say for instance, geisha women, who are seen as objects of beauty. Quite constrained, not just physically bound with their feet and with kimonos, but the idea of celebrating subservience. And maybe that's something that you might recount in the automaton, the soubrette in The Tiger's Bride, this object of perfection, of submissiveness of the female, and how that is perhaps related to her experience in Tokyo. One of the things as well, she kind of reacts against a kind of Catholic Church, and we see in this text, as opposed to Dracula, a kind of much more sort of negative presentation of the church as a place that breeds superstition and sort of prejudice. And say, for instance, in Wolf Alice, we don't see a very kind and loving, nurturing sort of church, but rather a church that makes the girl ashamed of herself. Okay, one of the things to remember is that she's writing in short story form. It's not the novel. There is no novel. It's a collection of short stories. So short stories play on showing, not telling. They often deal in ambiguous endings. We're not told what to make of the ending, so you have to consider it yourself. And that kind of works both for Gothic and it works for the message. She wants the readers to engage in her short stories. So we're never really told what we're meant to think, but rather we're shown. So for instance, at the end of The Tiger's Bride, the tiger licks off her skin. Is it an abrasive, violent act, or is it a liberation in which this girl gets in touch with her inner animal and is liberated sexually and from herself? We're not told, but we're shown. So showing and telling, showing very much works for the short story form. Okay, short stories, because of their brevity, deal in symbolism, and Gothic deals in symbolism, and so they're kind of allied sort of genres that kind of work in terms of how short stories work. So there's use of repetition, and again, she's rewriting fairy stories, she's reframing fairy stories. So think about what kind of narrative is used to tell this story here. Does it change? What are the patterns that we have? And where do we get this sense of short stories being about an epiphany, about one thing, in which there's a kind of transformative new perspective? So short stories are usually dealing with one thing and one kind of transformation. So it's trying to see each story in terms of what is the most essential thing in this short story, and what kind of epiphany or transformation do we have. Okay, so we talk about, if we see it as a collection, rather like an album, people think about what they put as their first song and what they put as their last song. The Bloody Chamber, so we have this innocent girl who is kind of bought, if you like. She's poor and she's bought by the Marquis, and she, what he's really buying is her innocence. But she's not entirely corruptive. There's a kind of sense that, you know, she discovers her own potential for corruption as well, and she's kind of implicit. She's complicit in that, and she enjoys it to an extent. But we also see that she becomes aware in the Bloody Chamber that if she is just merely passive, she will be a victim rather like the other three wives. And ultimately, she is saved by her mother. But by the end story, Wolf Alice is a young girl who is also transformed. And again, the idea of puberty is a transformative sense. She sees herself in a new way. And she ends up saving the Count, the werewolf, from the villagers. So Carter's perhaps showing us that it's this kind of journey from passivity to autonomy, and maybe you can think about the stories in between and what kind of different perspectives they give us. But maybe it's interesting to see the collection as a whole, from how does it begin to how does it end, and is there a kind of interpretation that you could make about that? Okay, one of the things to consider also, literary context. The literary context is the most important one, so you should be thinking about all of the different ways that this works as a literary text and what influences it. And perhaps this text can be seen as a postmodern text. Again, postmodern texts kind of play on their own artificiality. They play on intertextuality. And Carter does this, and she's in the tradition of that. And so all of the stories are full of allusions to Red Riding Hood, to vampires, werewolf stories, to folkloric fiction of the Green Man in the Erl King, and Pandora's Box, and the Mark of Cain. So you should be able to spot those allusions and how she uses them. Postmodern fiction plays on genre, subverts genre playfully. So she's doing that as well. She's using fairy stories, subverts it. Gothic, she subverts it. She takes some stories and rewrites them, fairy stories, in new forms. So she's mixing high and low culture, but she's also writing in the form of magic realism as well. Again, South American trend of like imagining the supernatural as real. And this allows her to be liberated from realism and convey specific messages. So consider how the text works as a postmodern text as well, and what it shares and how it's different to Dracula as well. I kind of mentioned the intertextuality aspect of this, and so you should, at different points in your essay, kind of show the examiner that you're aware how this text is not formed from thin air, but that how it plays on and reacts to other stories or other references. So, for instance, the Marquis' book collection is foregrounding or foreshadowing the eventual potential death of the woman, because it plays on sadomasochistic titles and paintings that are kind of, the reader has some kind of foreground pragmatic knowledge of. And because we know these fairy stories, we know how they end. And so we can look at how she changes them and what is the implicit message behind those changes. The other form that she uses is obviously Gothic, and Gothic is full of symbolism. Now, why does she use the Gothic form as well? Because Gothic, at the heart of Gothic, is transgression. And perhaps Carter is asking us to consider what rules are being broken, and are these actually the right rules that should be broken. Gothic tends to set up females as entrapped victims, and in many ways reinforces things that fairy stories suggest. Innocence is under threat. Girls must be saved by men. They are the victims of male uncontrolled desires. Their virginity is at stake. And Carter is perhaps using symbolism to maybe question some of these ideas. So you should consider the symbolism that's used as recurring motifs throughout the stories. The ideas of eyes, being watched, being in a sense trapped, the use of colours. and red and white, and again sort of highlighting virginity and perhaps sexual transgression or the loss of virginity. But we also see the symbolism of skin, and skin being hidden behind a mask, or being licking through the layers of skin to the true self. So Carter uses settings and symbolism to sort of elaborate on certain themes. We've got also the theme of entrapment, birds being trapped in cages. Again, symbolism perhaps of the entrapment of women, and keys and locks and rooms being locked and being trapped in forests or trapped in castles, trapped in chateaus. Again, the idea of Gothic is used to sort of suggest wider social concerns of the position of women. Sorry. Okay, so consider how, as context is about 50% of the answer, you have to be able to write not big chunks of history about Carter's life, and not big chunks about what postmodernism is, but almost short, concise little statements that hint at a greater knowledge. And that's something that you need to sort of get into your answer. So you don't need anything more. Let's take the example of Carter lived in Japan for 2 years as an outsider and an outcast. This informs her presentation of Wolf Alice, who is on a journey of self-discovery, who is an outsider, who is outcast because she's grown up with wolves, who doesn't live like a human. So you don't need to have any more than 1 or 2 sentences. The Snow Child, like her novel Wise Children, sees Carter unafraid to explore transgression and taboo. So just in 1 sentence, there's the hint at your knowledge of another text, that the examiner can tick that as a kind of an awareness of how this text is informed by other texts. So you don't need to write big chunks, but you do need to get a range of different contexts into your answer. Okay. Right, A05 comes into this. Critical perspectives or critical readings. I'll talk very briefly about each of these, how you might use them, but I'm not going to go into great detail. You'll do that yourself, perhaps. Obviously, the feminist reading is the one that you would explore in many ways, looking at the perspective of the female in the text, sense of entrapment, and perhaps a sense of emancipation or liberation or transformation at the end. Feminist readings are interested in exploring gender inequality. They're particularly interested in exploring female sexuality. But feminist readings are also looking at the presentation of gender and the presentation of males as well. So don't forget how males are presented in different ways in these texts, not always negatively. Equally, how females are not always presented as victims, and who are not always presented as perhaps good, like the Countess in The Snow Child. She's complicit in the subjugation of the girl, like the nuns in Wolf Alice. They're complicit in making her life even more miserable. The Marxist reading of text, again, I mentioned briefly how Carter's not only interested in gender equality, but perhaps that many of the stories kind of touch on wealth inequality, and how fairy stories often play on wealth inequality. We get in these stories absent fathers, innocent girls who come from poverty and are bought in many ways. And so Marxist readings of text are interested in exploring power inequality and wealth inequality, and how that creates divisions in society, and how it creates divisions within people themselves, how they are alienated from each other, but also alienated from themselves. To the point, for instance, that if we look at the Marquis in the Bloody Chamber, his extreme wealth alienates him from everyone around him. He's a sociopath, and he's allowed to carry out sociopathic acts because his wealth allows it. And perhaps he's alienated from himself. He doesn't see any sense of right and wrong. And the evidence of that is his 3 wives, that hanging for his own pleasure in his bloody chamber. He's alienated from his own sense of what is morally right in the world as well. So you can explore the text from the point of view of how wealth divides, inequality of wealth both divides people from themselves, divides people from society, and leads to a sense of alienation. And only when that's overcome can they be truly themselves. And perhaps in the same way that the aristocratic vampire in Lady in the House of Love has to be released not only from the gaze for her family, but also from the aristocratic wealth of her family. And in death, she's released to find her true self. Remember that readers respond to text in different ways, and so consider how a reader of Carter is not only responding to the text, but brings their own knowledge to the text. We're aware of stories like Red Riding Hood and fairy stories and Gothic stories. They're such familiar texts. And so how they are changed by Carter is interesting, and consider what is your own response to these stories, because that's a valid critical reading as well. Okay, I thought this is an interesting quote because Carter's not a traditional feminist. In many ways, she's looking at how, she's not afraid to criticise women in how they collude and connive in their condition of slavery. She's not placing everything as at the fault of men. And that men are victims of a patriarchal society as much as women are. Okay, I'm going to try and run through very quickly in a minute each of the stories that we talked about. Obviously, the Bloody Chamber is full of symbolism. Keys, locks, stains, paintings and books that reference the foreshadowing death of this girl. We've got the traditional sense of innocence and villainy, the sadism of the accounts and the innocence of the girl. But again, Carter's interested in blurred lines, liminal boundaries being blurred, ambiguity and obscurity. This girl isn't as innocent as she seems. She's kind of enjoying the pleasure of her own sexual discovery. But at the same time, we get this sense of she's constantly viewed. She's at the viewing pleasure, the voyeuristic pleasure of the Count. He's in much viewing her innocence being corrupted, and she is traditionally entrapped as well. Equally, there's a woman in there who's no help to her at all. The housekeeper, who probably knows her eventual fate but doesn't do anything to help her. But the Bloody Chamber is interested in seeing things in new ways and how the woman sees herself in new ways. It's a first-person account. You should consider the narrative of this story. This girl is given an account of her previous self. The narrator is no longer the young girl that she is in the story. She's looking back at herself, and she's looking back at that sense of an epiphany, a transformation, her own awareness of her own potentiality for corruption. This story is about both passivity, the passivity of the wives who merely become the viewing pleasure. Even in death, they're smiling, and they still continue to be acting out the visual pleasure of the Count. And the girl is potentially going that way as well, until she's saved by her mother, okay, who again comes in and changes the story. Carter changes the story completely. Interestingly, we've got the piano tuner who's blind, who doesn't see the girl in the same way. He doesn't see her guilt, but she's left at the end is pleased. He can't see her guilt, but she can. That stain never leaves her. Perhaps Carter's saying something about I don't know, virginity, female guilt. Is she entirely liberated at the end? We're not told, but we're shown and we're forced to consider and interpret that story ourselves. The Courtship of Mr Lyon, again, the reframing of the Beauty and the Beast story. But again, now we get a kind of, the Beast has a sense of vulnerability. Initially, she's the object of desire. She's bought she's an object that goes from her father to Mr Lyon. Again, sense of female objectification is there. But it's not as simple and straightforward as that. The fairy story conventions are subverted. Beauty, it's never a good idea to call anyone beauty. She's subverted by her own vanity. Again, the use of mirrors is a recurring motif in Carter. She's transformed not only by the city, but also by the sense of wealth. She's a bit too pleased with herself. Creases occur around her lips. She forgets about Mr Lyon. And he withers away, gradually becoming more like a man and vulnerable. And she goes back to save him, perhaps. Or is she manipulated emotionally to go back to him? Carter, interestingly, leaves kind of a degree of ambiguity in her stories that it's worth exploring, perhaps. The Tiger's Bride is in some way a response to Mr Lyon. I believe I read somewhere that Carter wasn't too happy with Mr Lyon the way it came out. She wanted to give a more assertive female in The Tiger's Bride. And so these stories kind of go together. It's a kind of reaction to Mr Lyon. So we can see how they progress within the collection. Again, there's lots of symbolism that goes on in this story, most of which I've forgotten right at this moment. But I'm kind of reminded of the automaton, the clockwork soubrette. Soubrette is a female character, flirtatious female character in an opera. But here she carries a powder puff and a mirror. Again, the idea, she's the essence of vanity and female objectification. She wants to put makeup on the girl. She's seen as the submissive, perfect idea of the submissive female, perhaps rather like the geisha in Japan that Carter might have witnessed. This is a first-person narration. We have a predatory patriarch in some sense. He demands to see this girl naked. But then we also have the absent father. But then she puts her own demands on. She says, no, you're going to see me from the waist down. You're going to have this. There's going to be these demands. And in that, she says, you're going to then deposit me by the church. She forces the tiger to see the error of his ways, and a single tear falls from him. She takes away his power. Okay, in many ways, she is then transformed, and she goes to him. And then there's a kind of union of liberation. Again, he licks away the skin, and she does it willingly. Or is it? You can see that in many ways as a transformation of liberation and union. She's getting in touch with her animal self. Carter's perhaps suggesting that we should take off the coats of our civilized selves and find our inner animals in between. Or is it more of an abrasive attack in which, again, she's at the mercy of this tiger? Again, you can perhaps see that Carter leaves a kind of ambiguity at the end of the stories. The Snow Child takes, again, fairy story conventions. We've got the idea perhaps of Snow White, Cinderella, again, someone conjured for the count, an object of desire. The colours of white and an alienated landscape, red, again the suggestion of blood, and the transgressions of the count having a sexual act while his wife looks on. Carter, like her stories, is not afraid to confront sexual transgression. But what's interesting also is like the Countess looks on and is in no way trying to save the girl, and is complicit in her own demise. And for that, revenge is taken with by being pricked by the thorn, the symbolism of the rose that's left, and it bites. Is that the revenant returning? Is Carter saying that if females just stand by passively and allow transgression to happen, will they be injured themselves? Is there no escape from that unless they take autonomy? That's one way of looking at it, I suppose. The Erl King. Increasingly, this is becoming a story that has more resonance for some of the classes. On the surface, we've got a typical Gothic villain. The Erl King is like the personification of the Green Man in folklore tradition, someone who personifies the forest. And the basic shape of the tale is simple. A young girl enters the forest, meets with the Erl King, who transforms young girls into caged birds. Again, that sense of entrapment. Despite enjoying her dreamlike rapture of her time in the forest, the girl resolves to kill the Erl King and release the trapped young women. What's interesting about this story is how Carter blurs everything. There's a sense of ambiguity. There's talk about lots of light and allusions to light, maybe a reference to Emily Dickinson's poetry. So we've got lucidity and clarity, but at the same time, things can't be seen in this dense forest. We've got the shift in narrative going from second person direct address to first person. And we've got shifts even in time. It goes from the present to the past. And that sense of time passing, the seasons passing, heralds a kind of symbolism perhaps of death. The haunting sense of the imminent cessation of being. So this is a story that plays on sensation and ambiguity and obscurity. But there's always the hint of perhaps death for the young girl. The woods swallow you up. All will fall still. All lapse. The Erl King, with his pointed teeth, reminds us perhaps of vampires. And we've got that sense of trapped spirits in pretty cages, girls in cages. There is a sense of sexual indulgence and communion. She's kind of goblin ridden, and there's a kind of nakedness in which she's kind of described as like a skinned rabbit. But in this kind of union, there's also the sense that the girl will liberate the other birds. And so again, with her hair, she kind of traps and strangles the Erl King. But we're left with a kind of dizzying sense of confusion in this story, in the sense of one of the last sentences of the story: "Mother, you have murdered me." Again, the girl is described as the mother. What does this mean? It twists the relationship around so that we're kind of left with a kind of dizzying sense of not quite sure what's going on. The Lady in the House of Love is isolation and entrapment, and you can see that both in the settings, the outside of the chateau, but also the inside of the chateau. She's trapped on the outside and she's trapped on the inside. She's trapped in time. She's wearing a wedding dress to a wedding she's never going to go to. She's trapped by a sense of fate, the cards, a sense that she is death and the maiden. We've got lots of subversion and use of Gothic tropes. We've got the visual appearance of the vampire wasted away, fingers and long fingernails, voluptuous lips that remind us of the female Gothic vampires. We've got the male gaze, her ancestors looking down on her. But we do have that sense of change, the potential for change, and the symbolism shown in the cards. Death can also mean change, not necessarily a liberation of death. Can mean change as well. We have the male, again the innocent male this time, who initially sees her voluptuous lips as the lips of a whore, and he sees her initially with that kind of traditional male gaze, but then he learns to see her in a new way, a more maternal way. And his kiss of her is the kiss of a mother kissing the blood away on an injured child's finger. And so Carter is showing us that women alongside women have the ability to change and transform. Metamorphosis. again, the allusion to tales of Ovid comes through all of the stories. Transformation and change, that everyone has the ability to change. So in this story, there's a story of liberation. The bird in the cage, the symbolism of that bird. Can it learn a new song? Can the vampire change? And Carter is perhaps suggesting at the end of the story that yes, despite maybe we're trapped in our own sense of entrapment. When the man opens the windows to the chateau, it's just a dilapidated chateau. She's not really trapped, but she does sense that she is trapped herself. So maybe we're entrapped by our own sense of entrapment. And that men and women, if they see themselves in new ways, have the ability to change. And so this is a story about liberation. And perhaps it's also a love story. The man goes off to war in France. The suggestion is that he's going to die and that they will be reunited in death. So this is a story, a love story full of paradox, that a love story in which to truly love, someone must die.